I really want to stress, I think, some of the problems and issues that Chris French raised, and the importance, really, of actually justifying and seeing the purpose of philosophy of education. And I think it does need constantly to be defended. I think there was a time, certainly in Britain, when it flourished. And there are particular reasons why it did flourish. One was the creation of the B.Ed degree in the 1960s, and the change of what we call training colleges to colleges of education, indicating that really we need to do more than train teachers. We need to give them that underlying capacity to think seriously about the purpose of education, about what they're doing, and all the things connected with it. So the B.Ed degree did that, and as a result of that, there was the work of Richard Peters, as frequently been mentioned, who famously said in 1962 that the job of the philosophy of education is to get rid of the mush in educational theory, all the kind of silly things that people say. We need a much more stricter, more philosophically disciplined way of thinking about education. And there was the growth of the diploma courses and the master's courses, and so all these various colleges of education around the country needed people to teach philosophy, and it was a really flourishing kind of business. But as Chris has referred to, one is now seeing actually the demise of that. The fact is, we don't really want people to be thinking too much in those sort of terms. And this then brings the importance of arguing for philosophy education very much onto the political agenda. I say onto the political agenda because we are seeing, as Chris pointed out, actually a suspicion of the fact that teachers are encouraged to think more deeply about what they're doing, because what they are being expected to do is carry out. They've become, to use this phrase, the deliverers of the curriculum, not curriculum thinkers. The curriculum is thought out over there by politicians and so on. It needs to be delivered. What we don't want is that delivery spoilt by these teachers asking questions about the purpose and so on of what they've been asked to deliver. And we shouldn't really be too surprised about that because it always has been the case that to think philosophically about these matters is seen by those who run the systems to be extremely dangerous. The great teacher Socrates was made to take hemlock because his philosophical questioning was seen to corrupt the youth of Athens. John Dewey, who's frequently been referred to, whose democracy in education inspired generations of teachers across the world, was called worse than Hitler by some who felt that he infected schools with epistemological relativism and substituted socialization for true education. Dewey was seen as both a hero and he was hated by many in America, as he thought that getting teachers to think was not a good thing for the pursuit of education. Now, what do we mean by standards? And what could be meant by such standards going up or down? Take, for example, the language I've mentioned, the one on reading capacity. Standards don't go up or down. If the standards go up or go down, it can only be by reference to the standards by which standards are judged to be going up or down. By the same logic, the standard by which standards are judged to go up and down does itself go up or down according to the standard by which the standard, by which standard, and so on ad infinitum. By the way, I think I am the only person in the world who's so far discovered the logical flaw in the whole of the PISA exercises. So don't you actually publish it, that's still for me to do. Now, standards change as education tries to keep up with the changing social and economic challenges. Standards cannot go up or down. Rather, it is performance according to agreed standards which go up or down. Standards are the benchmarks against which performance is judged to be good or bad, elegant or crude, intelligent or stupid. But the standards themselves change, not rise or decline, and that change standard relates to the changes in what you think is important. They logically relate to the purpose of the activity. The meaning of educational standards, which underpin much educational research, depends on the aims of education, and thus on the values which are embodied in such aims. You cannot decide on what are the standards by which to judge performance without first making explicit what the aims of education are. Standards logically relate to the aims of an activity and to what one means by being educated. We can't dodge that question. It will permeate everything that we do with students and teachers. Therefore, to conclude this little bit, philosophy, as Socrates demonstrated, often begins with the question, what do you mean? It's the job of philosophy to scratch beneath the surface of what are thought to be agreed meanings, and to show that our accounts of the world are much more complicated than is often assumed, that our intelligence is bewitched by the misuse of language. It is through learning what is worthwhile, knowledge and practices of many different kinds, that one learns to live a distinctively human life. Schools ideally give access to deeper and wider reflection on the human condition. Education, therefore, for Oakeshott is what he refers to as the conversation between the generations of mankind, in which they are introduced to the voice of poetry, to the voice of science, to the voice of history, to the voice of literature, to the voice of philosophy. Therefore, the metaphor of conversation creates very different expectations from that of hitting targets. One criterion of a good conversation is that you cannot anticipate the outcome. To do so would not be the nature of a serious interaction taking place between the pupil and the culture they are introduced to, between the pupil and the teacher, between the pupil and the pupil. There are therefore two aspects of this language of education which I wish to emphasize. First, Peters argued that one logical characteristic of to educate is like that of to reform. If I talk of reforming someone, I talk about making them somehow for the better. If I reform a criminal, it means that person is no longer a criminal. If I talk about educating a person, as opposed to merely training and instructing them, it is to imply that the learner is in some way transformed for the better by what he or she has learned. He or she has, in Oakeshott's sense, come to live a more distinctively human life. At the center of educational thinking by policymakers and teachers, therefore, must be deliberations of what it means to live a more human life. What is it to be and to become more fully a person? A topic, of course, which has interested philosophers from the very beginning. The concept of person, therefore, must shape educational policy and practice, and therefore what is distinctively educational research. So something then about educating persons. We train dogs and horses. We train people. But we educate persons. We don't educate donkeys. To recognize someone as a person is to recognize them not as objects to be used for others' purposes, but as ends in themselves, worthy of respect. In that sense, the concept of person is more than a descriptive term for a physical object. It is a moral concept, expressing the recognition of their own distinctive rights, worthiness for respect, capacity to have views of their own. They are ends in themselves, not to be treated as means to an end. This distinction between people as physical objects and people as persons is crucial to our understanding of education and to our criticism of policy and research, which in collapsing the distinction reduces people to mere objects. That depersonalization of people is seen in so many ways in current policy backed by research. Successful learning is equated with what is measurable. Teaching is reduced to producing the behaviors which will gain the required grades in national tests. Priority is given to learners who are borderline between success and failure so that schools can rise in league table. I've seen this operating in some of the poorest districts of London, schools which actually inspired me by what they were doing to educate these young people, but were seen as failing schools because the kids weren't doing well in the test, and the concentration of resources on those who are borderline D and C. And I remember the deputy head saying, I have to devote all my life to this, and it's nothing to do with education. When I retired from Oxford, I was given £1 million, not from me personally, by the Nuffield Foundation to do this big 6-year survey of 14 to 19 education, the biggest that we'd had for 50 years in Britain. And so one got all this evidence, all these statements, all this research and one thing and another, but how do you pull all this together in terms of a coherent report? And we did so because we said, what ultimately is the question we should be asking? And that question that we asked in the Nuffield Review was, what counts as an educated 19-year-old in this day and age? And that really challenged people, and it really got a very constant ethical debate going on within that and within the teachers and within the schools. As with all moral questions, one cannot expect unanimity. Different people, societies will reach different conclusions to that question. But such differences should not preclude critical examination of the often unexamined valued assumptions that undermine educational policy and practice and research. That critical examination requires reflection on what it means to be and to grow as a person. For example, having the knowledge in its different forms for what Dewey referred to as the intelligent management of life, the capabilities to flourish practically, the virtues and moral seriousness for living a distinctively human life, and the sense of community whereby one recognizes the interdependence of one for the other. This is most important in thinking about what is distinctively educational research. We have seen on the one hand how engaging thoughtfully in education requires addressing the aims of education. What counts as an educated person in this day and age? We have seen too how policymakers and teachers need to take into account what social scientists may say through the various forms of empirical research which bear upon the attempts to improve the education of these young people. But reconciling and integrating these different considerations requires systematic and critical deliberation. Such critical and systematic deliberation is at the heart of educational research, and for that reason the teacher has to be seen as a researcher in the following sense. The teacher is trying to realize in practice certain educational goals and values, and I'm most grateful for Alec Matthews' paper on this, The Philosophy in Practice. Those goals embody the educational values that he or she is committed to, though often only implicitly. The reflective teacher, and thanks Rohit for his paper on this, the reflective teacher will constantly try to articulate those goals in the context of his or her practice. And no doubt in the light of what others say, what the teachers see to be of educational values for the learners in his or her care will evolve through criticism. Furthermore, in implementing those educational aims, the deliberations of the reflective teacher will take into account what researchers, social scientists have said, not slavishly, because as I argued above, what is generally applicable may not be so for these particular children in this situation. For example, generalizations about the benefits of the phonic approach to teaching of reading would not apply to children with glue ear, and 30% of the kids in Oxfordshire suffer from glue ear, which prevents you being able to distinguish sound very clearly. So therefore, the phonic method would not be appropriate for those children. All that applies to the reflective teacher. That is not quite the same as the teacher as the researcher, but a precursor to it. What turns reflection into research is, one, clarifying as precisely as possible the aims of educating these learners, the knowledge and practical capabilities that are valued, the issues of social concern that impact on them, the sense of personal worth which each is striving to acquire. And two, gathering evidence which would support the claim that such aims have been implemented or not, in which case new approaches have to be found, tested, refined in the light of further experience. Part of that refining would lie in openness to criticism of others, other teachers, and the feedback from the learners. The essence of the research, therefore, is the clarity of the thesis, the claim being made, the evidence which is relevant to challenging that claim, and the openness to the critical scrutiny of the thesis and of the evidence provided. For this to happen, teachers within or across schools need to become supportive communities of researchers. Knowledge grows through criticism, as Popper argued, and so one needs to create the sort of communities where criticism can flourish, where the thesis can be tested, hopefully survive, or, where that is not the case, be refined. This is so important because the natural human instinct is to avoid criticism and to avoid exposure to any evidence which makes one question what one believes to work. So by way of conclusion, educational thinking, whether that be in policy or in practice, raises questions which traditionally have been within the province of philosophy, ethical questions about the aims of education and what is worth learning, about the nature of knowledge to be acquired, about the relation of private to the public good. Failure to address these questions leads to a defective policy and practice and research. That philosophical questioning often begins with the puzzlement over what is meant when policies and practices are advocated, with the realization that there is ambiguity in what is said, and that at the center of such ambiguity are assumptions about values, or about what it means to know, or about what counts as an educated person. Furthermore, key to such educational questioning should be the teachers, who, far from being the deliverers of the curriculum, must be the curriculum thinkers. And furthermore, philosophically aware and questioning, they, the teachers, need to engage in the research which will enable them to teach better. Thank you very much.
You'd mentioned, Dr. Pring, that no one can predict educational outcomes, and so then no one can really predict educational outcome. So my question is then, how can one effectively measure or assess the impact of education?
Right.
Or should one?
Well, I think educational judgment. And I think in order to do that, then I think that one has got to set out what to you seem to be the criteria against which you, as a school, would like to see yourself judged. Now, if you're working in the two schools that I have mentioned, they would say that some of the criteria is that these young people come to school, settle down without any kind of discipline problems, that they are able to talk freely and openly with each other. There aren't sort of fights in the... that would be one of the sort of criteria by which I would like to be judged, have my school judged. I would like to say that, of course, you do have to assess these youngsters to say exactly, have they got particular learning difficulties, are they, and so on. And you'd want to have assessments whereby you can say, yes, they have made progress. They are able now to read better than when they first came. I don't want to ditch all that kind of thing, not at all. But you don't want to have the kind of assessments by which it's the assessments which determine the educational judgment, rather than the educational judgment which determines the sort of tests which are appropriate. And if you do make that educational judgment, you'll of course have it that they can read. I'd also want to say, it's not that just they have the capacity to read, that actually they're interested in reading books, and not just being able to read, for the test. So I think a school and school districts have got to be themselves engaged in saying, how do we want to be judged? And I'd like to think their schools are set in a sufficient democratic kind of context that they're able to share this with the parents and with the wider community, who also will have a voice in this. When you come to the secondary schools, local employers want to say, well, of course, we also want young people to be emerging from the schools who are able, to do certain sorts of work, to behave, get to school, to work on time, all that kind of thing. But you'd work out a series of criteria by which you want to say, we are transforming these kids to live more human lives, and these are the ways in which we can actually say this is to be judged.